The towering pines of Crescent Lake loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged branches clawing at the slate-gray sky. Shadows sprawled across the forest floor, thick and oppressive, swallowing the faint trails that wove between the trees. The lake itself was still, a black mirror, reflecting the storm clouds gathering above. Despite its beauty, an air of unease blanketed the wilderness, as though the land itself held its breath, waiting. Park Ranger Miles Carter adjusted his hat as he stepped cautiously through the dense undergrowth. He'd received a report about an abandoned campsite near the lake, and while most calls turned out to be mundane, something about this one felt off. Pushing aside a low-hanging branch, he froze. Before him stood a tent, its fabric shredded and sagging, stained with dark, ominous streaks. A pool of blood had soaked into the forest floor, the metallic scent unmistakable in the damp air. The eerie silence that surrounded the scene was broken only by the distant caw of a crow, as if nature itself recoiled from the violence. "Jesus," he whispered under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio strapped to his chest. "Base, this is Ranger Carter. I've got a potential crime scene at Crescent Lake, north of Marker 3. Request immediate backup." He hesitated, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. The forest offered no answers, only the oppressive weight of its shadows. Near the torn tent, he spotted her. A woman sat slumped against a tree, her knees drawn to her chest. Her clothes were torn, her arms streaked with blood. Whether her own or someone else's, Miles couldn't tell. Her dark hair clung to her sweat-dampened face, and her eyes were glassy, fixed on a point in the distance as though she was seeing something only she could comprehend. "Mom!" Miles approached cautiously, keeping his voice low and steady. "Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" She didn't respond, only shivered despite the humidity of the summer air. Miles crouched in front of her, trying to meet her vacant gaze. "My name's Miles. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely above a whisper, she muttered, "It wasn't supposed to end like this." The tremor in her voice sent a chill down his spine. Miles's radio crackled as he called in the situation, his voice tight with urgency. "I've got a survivor. Female, mid-30s. She's unresponsive but conscious. We need paramedics on site ASAP." He scanned the campsite again. Shredded fabric, blood splatters, fragments of clothing, signs of a violent struggle. His gaze fell on a broken lantern, its glass glinting like fractured stars against the dark soil. The scene was a chaotic jigsaw puzzle, the pieces drenched in blood and despair. As Miles straightened, the woman let out a soft, broken sob. It was the first sound she'd made beyond her whispered words, and it was a sound that clawed at him, raw and guttural. The paramedics arrived quickly, their footsteps crunching against the forest floor as they assessed the woman. "Lauren," they said her name was. She flinched at their touch but didn't resist as they wrapped a blanket around her trembling frame. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Her words were heavy with regret, her tone a haunting mix of sorrow and fear. Miles stood back, his mind racing. What had happened here? What was Lauren running from? Or toward? As the paramedics led Lauren away, the forest seemed to breathe again, its oppressive stillness lifting slightly. But the tranquility felt hollow. The serene lake and swaying trees now nothing more than a facade for the horror they concealed. The wilderness had witnessed something unspeakable, and it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Miles lingered at the edge of the scene, his gut churning with unease. This wasn't just a random act of violence. There was something deeper here, something layered in betrayal and deceit. The whispers of guilt, the blood-streaked tent, the fragmented remains of what seemed like an idyllic camping trip gone horribly wrong. All of it pointed to secrets buried far deeper than the forest floor. And as the sun began its slow descent behind the horizon, casting the lake in hues of crimson, one thing became certain. The story was far from over. The car ride was quiet, punctuated only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the map in Mark's hands. Lauren's fingers gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. "You missed the turn," Mark muttered, folding the map with a sharp snap. "I didn't miss it. I'm taking the scenic route," Lauren replied, her voice clipped. Mark huffed but said nothing, turning his gaze to the trees blurring past the window. The weight of unspoken words filled the cabin. Resentments left to fester too long. They used to be good at this, Lauren thought, good at navigating life together. Now they couldn't even plan a simple trip without veering into awkward silences. Lauren had convinced herself this trip was about reconnecting, about salvaging what was left of their marriage. But deep down, she knew better. The guilt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. Elena's name lingered in the back of her mind like a forbidden melody. She needed this trip to forget, or at least pretend that life hadn't spun completely out of control. "I just want things to be normal again," she murmured to herself, barely audible over the tires crunching gravel. They reached the campsite as the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the trees. Mark was unloading the gear when another car pulled up, dust swirling in its wake. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as Elena stepped out, her confident stride slicing through the tension like a blade. "Sorry I'm late," Elena said smoothly, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mark's expression hardened. "Didn't know we were expecting company," he said flatly. "Last-minute addition," Lauren said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Elena's presence was electric, unsettling. Mark's instincts were rarely wrong, and they were screaming now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lauren stood by the edge of the lake, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Memories she had tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. Elena's laughter, the heat of forbidden touches, moments stolen in shadowed corners. What had started as a reckless impulse had spiraled into something dangerous, something she couldn't control. And now, with Mark here, the weight of her choices threatened to crush her. Mark watched Lauren from a distance, his jaw tight. Her body language was all wrong, guarded, distant. He'd been feeling it for months, that widening gap between them. And now Elena. He wasn't stupid. The glances, the subtle tension, it was all there, just beneath the surface. "She's hiding something," he muttered under his breath, his fists clenching at his sides. Ethan, Mark's childhood friend, had tagged along out of loyalty. He'd seen Mark through the worst of times and wasn't about to abandon him now. From his spot near the fire, Ethan observed quietly, his sharp eyes catching the fleeting glances between Lauren and Elena. Something was off. Mark deserved better. And if Ethan had to be the one to protect him from whatever mess was brewing, so be it. Lauren's mind drifted back to that first time. The rain had been relentless, driving them into Elena's cabin. They'd laughed over spilled wine, the tension between them thick and undeniable. One reckless kiss had been all it took to shatter her world. Lauren blinked, forcing herself back to the present. But the memory clung to her, a constant reminder of everything she stood to lose. The wind picked up as they set up camp, the sky darkening with ominous clouds. "Looks like we're in for a rough night," Ethan said, his voice low. Mark secured the tent stakes, his movements tense. Figures. Local warnings about sudden storms echoed in Lauren's mind, but it wasn't just the weather that unsettled her. Something was brewing, and it wasn't just in the sky. As night fell, the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across their faces. The air was thick with unspoken truths, the kind that fester and grow until they explode. Lauren's heart raced as Elena's gaze lingered a moment too long. Mark's eyes narrowed, suspicion etched into his features. Betrayal, manipulation, and desire simmered beneath the surface, ready to ignite. Secrets never stayed buried for long, especially not out here, where the wilderness had a way of revealing the truth. Mark's brow furrowed as he watched Lauren by the water's edge. Her shoulders were hunched, her gaze fixed on the rippling surface. She used to hum when she was lost in thought, but now there was only silence. At dinner, her laughter came a beat too late, her smiles brittle. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, his voice gentle but probing. Lauren flinched as though caught off guard. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mark nodded slowly, but doubt gnawed at him. Something was off. Something she wasn't telling him. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found Mark stacking firewood near the campsite. "You're quite the lumberjack," she teased, brushing a stray leaf from her sleeve. Mark grunted in response. Eleanor leaned against a tree, her expression casual but calculated. "Lauren's been distant lately, hasn't she?" Mark's hands stilled. "Why do you say that?" "Oh, nothing specific," Eleanor said with a shrug. "She just mentioned needing space. You know how it is." Mark's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I know how it is." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Ethan poked at the embers while Eleanor's voice carried over the group. "So, Mark," Eleanor said, with a sly smile, "what's your secret to keeping a marriage strong?" Mark's eyes flicked to Lauren, who stared into her mug of coffee. "Communication," he said tersely. Eleanor's smile widened. "Interesting. Some people might say honesty is just as important." Lauren's head snapped up. "What are you getting at?" "Nothing," Eleanor said innocently. "Just making conversation?" Mark's knuckles whitened around his mug. "Maybe stick to safer topics." The air grew thick with unspoken accusations. Even the fire seemed to burn hotter under the weight of their tension. After the others drifted to their tents, Ethan approached Lauren. "Got a minute?" he asked. She hesitated but nodded. They walked a few paces from the campsite. "Mark's not as clueless as you think," Ethan said quietly. "He's picking up on something." Lauren's throat tightened. "There's nothing to pick up on." Ethan's gaze was steady. "You sure about that? Whatever it is, fix it before it blows up in your face." Lauren found Elena by the edge of the forest, the moon casting silver shadows across her face. "We need to talk," Lauren said, her voice trembling. Elena's eyes narrowed. "Sounds serious." "It is. This, whatever we had, it's over." Elena's expression hardened. "You think you can just walk away?" "I have to." Elena took a step closer, her voice low and dangerous. "If you push me out, I'll make sure Mark knows everything." Lauren's breath hitched. "You wouldn't." Elena's smile was cold. Try me. Lauren's mind raced as she returned to the camp. Elena's threats echoed in her ears, turning guilt into a gnawing fear. She became hyper-aware of Mark's every glance, every question. Was he already piecing it together? The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as though the very earth conspired to betray her. That night, Lauren tossed and turned, her sleep fractured by vivid nightmares. Shadowy figures circled her, their voices accusing. Betrayer. Liar! She jolted awake, sweat slicking her skin. The forest was silent, but the echoes of her guilt lingered. Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He watched Lauren from a distance, his eyes sharp and unblinking. Her conversations with Elena only fueled his unease. "Where were you?" he demanded one afternoon. "Collecting firewood," Lauren said. "Alone?" Lauren hesitated. "Yes." Mark's lips thinned. "Funny. I didn't hear you." The tension between them crackled like static, each interaction fraying the edges of the fragile peace. The night was thick with darkness when the first scream shattered the quiet. Lauren bolted upright, her heart racing. She stumbled out of the tent, the cold biting her skin. "What's happening?" Ethan shouted, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Another scream pierced the night, followed by a deafening gunshot. The forest fell into stunned silence. Lauren's breath came in ragged gasps. Mark stood near the fire, the gun in his trembling hand, his face pale with shock. "What have you done?" Lauren whispered, her voice breaking. The truth, long buried, was finally clawing its way to the surface, and none of them would escape unscathed. Mark's fingers trembled as he unfolded the crumpled note he'd found tucked into Lauren's jacket pocket. The neat, deliberate handwriting was unmistakable. Elena's. "Can't wait until we're alone again. Love, E." A red haze clouded his vision. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, memories of stolen glances and whispered conversations between the two women coalesced into undeniable truth. Betrayal wrapped itself around his chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. He crumpled the note in his fist, rage simmering just beneath the surface. Mark stormed back to the campsite, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Lauren and Elena sat by the dwindling campfire, their laughter cutting through the night air. "You think I'm stupid?" Mark's voice was raw with fury. Lauren's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," he spat, waving the note in front of her face. "This, you and her. How long has this been going on?" Elena's expression hardened. "Mark, calm down." "Shut up," he roared, his voice echoing through the forest. "You've been lying to me, both of you." Mark's rage ignited like dry tinder. He lunged at Elena, his fists clenched. Lauren screamed, scrambling to her feet. "Mark, stop!" she pleaded, grabbing his arm. Elena twisted free, her eyes blazing. "You're pathetic," she sneered. "This was never about you." Mark's face contorted with fury. He shoved Lauren aside, advancing on Elena once more. Desperation gripped Lauren as she threw herself between them, pushing both toward the cliff's edge. Loose rocks shifted under their feet. "Stop it, all of you!" Lauren's voice cracked. The three grappled in a chaotic dance of rage and fear. The ground beneath them crumbled, stones tumbling into the abyss below. Mark's foot slipped. Time fractured into jagged pieces. Mark's arms flailed as he teetered on the edge. "Mark!" Lauren screamed, reaching for him. The fingers brushed for a fleeting moment. Then he was gone. His body plummeted into the darkness, the sickening thud of his landing echoing up the cliffside. Silence swallowed the forest, broken only by Lauren's ragged sobs. Elena stood motionless, her face pale but composed. "It's done," she said coldly. Lauren fell to her knees, trembling. "No, no, this isn't happening. Listen to me," Eleanor commanded, her voice steely. "We have to get our story straight." Eleanor knelt beside Lauren, gripping her shoulders. "Look at me," she demanded. "This was an accident. He slipped." Lauren shook her head violently. "He's dead because of us." "No," Eleanor insisted. "Because of himself. You want to go to prison? You want your whole life ruined?" Tears streamed down Lauren's face. "I can't do this." "You don't have a choice," Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. "We cover this up, or we both go down." Lauren's body shook uncontrollably as she stared into the void where Mark had fallen. Her mind replayed the scene in an endless loop, the struggle, his slip, the fall. Guilt gnawed at her insides, a relentless predator. "We have to move," Eleanor urged, her tone sharp. "Sitting here won't help." Lauren's voice was barely a whisper. "I loved him." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Then honor his memory by surviving this." Lauren swallowed hard, her breath hitching. She nodded weakly, though every fiber of her being rebelled against what came next. The forest seemed to close in around them as they descended the treacherous path to Mark's broken body. The weight of his lifeless form was unbearable, both physically and emotionally. "We need to get him to the ravine," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. Lauren's hands were slick with sweat and dirt as they struggled to drag Mark's body. Each step was a battle against gravity and grief. Night wrapped its cloak around them, the shadows deepening their sense of dread. The weight of their crime pressed down with every agonizing movement. A rustling in the underbrush froze them both. Ethan emerged from the darkness, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. His eyes widened at the sight before him, Mark's limp form, Lauren's tear-streaked face, and Eleanor's steely composure. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Lauren's lips quivered. "It was an accident." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Don't lie to me, Lauren." Lauren's heart pounded as she faced Ethan's piercing stare. Confession teetered on the edge of her tongue. But Eleanor's presence loomed like a shadow. "Help us," Eleanor commanded, stepping forward. "Or walk away and let the cops think you were part of it." Ethan's jaw clenched. "This isn't right." Lauren's voice was raw. "Please, Ethan." A tense silence hung between them, the weight of their fates balanced on a knife's edge. The early morning air clung to the scent of pine and damp earth as Park Ranger Miles Carter stepped out of his vehicle. His withered face, marked by years of chasing wilderness, disasters, and human folly, was a mask of grim determination. He surveyed the campsite, now cordoned off with bright yellow tape that fluttered in the breeze. Lauren stood nearby, pale and trembling, her eyes hollow. Eleanor leaned against a tree, arms crossed, her expression unsettlingly serene. "So," Carter began, his voice roughened by too many sleepless nights. "Who wants to tell me how a peaceful camping trip ended with a body at the bottom of a cliff?" Carter's questioning was relentless, but methodical. He circled the group like a predator, picking apart their fragmented accounts. Lauren stumbled over her words, her guilt bleeding through every stammered sentence. We went hiking," she said, her voice brittle. "Mark slipped. It was an accident." Eleanor's tone was smooth, rehearsed. "The trail was dangerous. We warned him, but he insisted on going closer to the edge." Carter's sharp eyes didn't miss the tension crackling between the two women. The stories didn't fit, and the physical evidence, disturbed soil and scuffed rocks, suggested something far more chaotic than a simple fall. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Lauren's sleepless nights were haunted by Mark's final scream and the echo of her own complicity. The weight of it pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. On the third night, she couldn't take it anymore. She walked into the ranger station, her face drawn with exhaustion. Carter looked up from his desk, his brows knitting together. "I need to talk," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't live with this." Lauren sat across from Carter, her hands trembling as she recounted everything: the affair, the confrontation, the struggle near the cliff. "Elena, she was the one who told me we had to cover it up," Lauren confessed, tears streaming down her face. "She said no one would believe it was an accident. She threatened me." Carter's expression remained stoic, but his eyes softened slightly. "And you went along with it?" Lauren nodded, shame tightening her throat. "But I'm done lying." Elena sat in the interrogation room, her posture regal despite the sterile surroundings. Carter leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Lawrence told us everything," he said. "You manipulated her, threatened her." Elena's lips curved into a faint smile. "Is that what she said?" "You don't seem too worried," Carter observed. Her eyes glinted with something cold and unyielding. "Worry is for people with regrets. I have none." Carter's jaw tightened. He'd seen hardened criminals before, but Elena's lack of remorse was chilling. Lauren stood on the porch of her parents' house, the weight of the past weeks etched into her features. The trial had been brutal, exposing every dark secret she'd tried to bury. Mark's family had glared at her with searing hatred, and she couldn't blame them. But there was a strange relief in the truth being out. Her mother stepped beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You'll get through this," she said softly. Lauren swallowed hard. "I don't know how." "One day at a time," her mother whispered. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Lauren's cooperation had earned her a reduced sentence, probation and mandatory counseling. She'd pay for her mistakes, but she wouldn't spend her life behind bars. Elna, however, wasn't as fortunate. The evidence against her, coupled with Lauren's testimony, painted a damning picture of manipulation and calculated cruelty. The judge's gavel fell with finality. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elena's expression remained unreadable as she was led away. Crescent Lake had returned to its serene facade, but its dark secrets lingered like a ghost. Lauren stood at the water's edge, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The memories would never leave: Mark's laughter, the betrayal, the chaos, and the fall. But she was learning to live with them. As she turned to walk back toward the trail, she knew one thing for certain. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her future. Lauren sat alone in her modest apartment, fingers trembling as she traced the edges of a photograph of Mark. His wide, trusting smile pierced through the fog of her guilt. The events that led to his death played on an endless loop in her mind. The deceit, the arguments, the desperate moments near the cliff. She pressed her palms to her temples, as though she could physically block the memories from overwhelming her. "Why didn't I stop?" she whispered to no one in particular. The question gnawed at her like a festering wound. The realization was brutal. One impulsive decision, a single betrayal, had spiraled into a nightmare. Her love for Mark had been genuine once, but somewhere along the way, Secrets and desires had corroded their bond until there was nothing left but tragedy. Even now, with Elena behind bars, Lauren could hear her voice, silken and calculated. "You'll be fine," Elena had insisted, her eyes gleaming with cold assurance. "We'll cover this up together." But it had been a lie. Elena had never cared about anything but control. Even locked away, she haunted Lauren's thoughts, a shadow that refused to dissipate. "You'll never own me again," Lauren whispered fiercely to the empty room, as though Elena could somehow hear her defiance. Lauren's gaze drifted to the sparse bookshelf near the window. Law books she'd once pored over sat untouched, their spines dusty. Her ambitions had crumbled under the weight of guilt, but there was still a faint spark within her, the will to rebuild. She stood and walked to the mirror. Her reflection was gaunt, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Yet there was strength in that face, too, carved by hardship and survival. "You're not done," she told herself. "Not yet." Trust had been shattered, lives ruined, but Lauren clung to the hope that redemption was possible, even for someone like her. The crisp morning air bit at her skin as Lauren stepped onto the familiar trail leading to Crescent Lake. The landscape was unchanged, serene and picturesque, a cruel contrast to the chaos that had unfolded there. Her boots crunched against the dirt path as she neared the water's edge. The lake's surface shimmered under the pale sunlight, but all she could see were echoes of pain and regret. Mark's laughter, the accusations, the final scream before silence. She knelt by the shore, fingers skimming the frigid water. The chill was grounding, reminding her that she was still here, still breathing. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to the still waters, "Some wounds never heal, but they can remind us of the truth we can no longer deny." The truth was simple, yet devastating. She had made choices that led to ruin, but she was still capable of choosing differently now. Standing, Lauren took a deep breath. The weight of the past would always be there, but it no longer defined her. As she walked back up the trail, leaving the lake behind, there was no promise of immediate peace, but there was possibility, and that was enough.